Hello and welcome to the second session in the Constitution Unit's 2023 Summer Conference. The theme for the conference as a whole is the future of the Constitution, and in this session we're looking particularly at devolution and the Union. My name is Alan Rennick. I'm the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit and I'm your chair for this session. So what are we discussing? Well, uncertainties over the UK's future territorial politics are great at the moment. The Scottish independence movement is, I think it's probably fair to say, in turmoil. There are ideas for major changes to the nature of the Union coming notably from the Welsh government and from Labour's Brown Commission. And further devolution within England is also on the cards. The Constitution Unit is, of course, based in London, so we're particularly, though not exclusively, interested in what the UK government might do in relation to all of these things. Are reforms needed to the forms and practice of devolution or to the fundamental structure of the Union? And if so, how might ministers approach them? To explore these matters, we're joined by a fantastic panel. Dr. Anwen Elias is Reader in Politics at Aberystwyth University and an expert on territorial politics in Europe. She's also a member of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, which has been established by the Welsh Government to examine reforms to the Union and to Welsh democracy. Kezia Dugdale is Director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, which seeks to promote a positive case for politics and public service through research and other activities. In a former life, Kezia was, of course, a member of the Scottish Parliament between 2011 and 2019, and the leader of the Scottish Labour Party from 2015 to 2017. And Professor Mike Kenny is Chair of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and the inaugural Director of the Bennett Institute of Public Policy. He too is an expert on territorial politics in the UK and beyond, and is perhaps best known for his award-winning 2014 book, The Politics of English Nationhood. Welcome and croeso to all of you. You might notice that I haven't yet mentioned Northern Ireland. That's not because we think it's unimportant, far from it. Rather, it's because the issues in Northern Ireland are in many ways quite distinct, and we just can't do them justice alongside everything else in a single panel. We did hold a special seminar in April on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, marking its 25th anniversary and examining possible paths forward. And you can find the recording of that on our website. So back to now, each of the speakers will make opening remarks of 5 minutes or so, after which we will have some discussion in the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. Questions will be gathered by Conor Kelly, whom you can also see on the screen. If you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function rather than the chat. Conor will select a broad range of questions and read them out. And if you'd like to ask your question anonymously, you can indicate that when you submit your question. Let me just also note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. With that, let me hand over to the first speaker, who will be Anwen.
Diolch, Alan, pnawn da bawb. Thank you for the opportunity to join the panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about devolution from the perspective of Wales. And I think it's probably fair to say that the experience of devolution in Wales has been less dramatic, perhaps, than in other parts of the UK. And for that reason, Wales hasn't really featured very prominently in discussions about the constitutional future of the United Kingdom. Since the establishment of the National Assembly for Wales in 1999, although there have been a series of reforms to the original devolution settlement, these have been mostly reforms discussed by and delivered through negotiations between political elites and officials in Wales and Westminster. They really had very little broader implication for, or even resonance with, debates elsewhere in the UK about the territorial constitution and how different parts of the Union relate to each other and are governed. In this respect, Wales has been a bystander, really, as debates and events have played out elsewhere. I think that is changing. And I think it's changing in particular because of the way in which the Welsh Labour Party has positioned itself as a key player, as a key thinker in issues to do with the future of devolution and its relationship to the Union. And also in trying to model a process for having a broader, more inclusive discussion about the future governance of Wales and the UK. So on this first point of positioning on constitutional issues, I would argue that amongst the political parties in the UK that are committed to the unity of the United Kingdom, I think it's from Welsh Labour that we've seen some of the most ambitious thinking in terms of how the constitutional architecture of the UK might be changed in order to keep that union together and to strengthen the relationships between its component parts. And the starting point for Welsh Labour, of course, is Wales' place within the union. But from that starting point, the ideas that have been put forward have far-reaching implications for the whole of the UK. So the parties talked, for example, of radical federalism based on the idea of a voluntary union of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom coming together to share sovereignty in areas of key interest through a partnership of equals. Now, that kind of idea goes much further than the vision of, for example, the Union of Nations that Gordon Brown set out in his recent report on the future of the UK. But then there's a second aspect as well, which I think is important in terms of how Welsh Labour have proposed taking the constitutional debate forward in Wales, but again with implications more broadly. So as Alan mentioned, in 2021, the Welsh Government established an independent commission on the constitutional future of Wales. And that commission, which has representation from the 4 main parties in Wales, as well as others of us who don't have a party political affiliation. So this commission has been given the remit to look at a range of constitutional options for Wales within the UK, but also for Wales outside of the UK, that is, an independent Wales. Now that's significant in itself, that the Commission is looking at the full range of options, but it's also important in the sense that the Commission was given the challenge of exploring different constitutional options by means of a national conversation with the people of Wales. And I think that's interesting because it's a commitment to shifting away from having debates about constitutional change that involve elites and officials to involving ordinary citizens whose lives are directly affected by the constitutional rules around who takes what decision where. And again, I think in the EU context, that's significant, it's very innovative. That kind of approach hasn't been tried elsewhere to thinking about constitutional change. So Wales isn't a bystander, I don't think anymore, but is trying to lead debate on devolution and the future of the Union, taking that debate to the people of Wales, but also to other parts of the UK. Now, of course, there are huge challenges here, not least because whilst we can have these conversations in Wales, we don't have any mechanism for delivering any of those changes by ourselves. Nevertheless, I think the fact that the debate is happening in Wales is really important, and I think there are interesting things to learn there about thinking more broadly about the constitutional future of the United Kingdom. And I'll stop there.
Anwen, that was great. Really good start. Let's move straight on to Kezia.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel this afternoon. In the 5 minutes I have to open today, I wanted to start by offering a little bit of a political overview of Scotland as I see it today, offer a little bit of an insight into how that might change this side of a general election, and if I've got time, a few thoughts on what might happen in the immediate aftermath of a general election in the context of devolution in the Union. And first of all, I'm going to have to slightly and politely disagree with your framing at the start there, Alan. I don't actually think the independence movement is in turmoil. There's no doubt that the SNP are facing significant difficulties just now, and perhaps the most difficult set of circumstances they have in recent history. but the polls suggest that support for independence is still very high, averaging out around about 48%. And then when you look at the party breakdowns, we've had 2 election polls recently. One, yes, shows a 10% drop in SNP support in the last 6 months, but that's a drop from 51% to 41%, and lots of political parties would envy a lead of 41%. And separately, the most recent poll had the SNP and Labour level pegging on 34%, which obviously looks and sounds very competitive and is leading to a lot of suggestions that Labour will gain heavily in a general election. But I would again point out that's the first time that Labour have been in the 30s since I think around about 2010. So I think we need to see a few more polls before we could really bank on that degree of progress. That said, though, that does provide a bit of political context to how we're talking about devolution in the Union in Scotland just now. And I would say the mood, certainly amongst the Unionist parties, is that there's no great demand or appetite for significant further powers for the Scottish Parliament. Obviously, we have the Brown Review, and we may get into the detail of that in due course, but constitutional reform is not one of Keir Starmer's 5 missions of the next Labour government, and also it's not at the forefront of the conversation around the political debate in Scotland at the moment. The dominant issue is, of course, the cost of living crisis. The mood in the Unionist parties is a bit deeper than that, though, and a bit more tactical. So if you look at who the prominent leaders and frontbench spokespeople are in the Unionist parties, they tend to come from a movement of Unionists that believes that ceding further powers to the Scottish Parliament will weaken the Union. That's their starting point. They believe that more so than their desire to perhaps make the devolution settlement work better or make Britain work better than it currently does. They're also of the mindset that why would you distract when your main political opponent is making its own mistakes? Why would you move the conversation into that territory voluntarily when there is so much scrutiny on the SNP's current standing around competency? And also they're taking a great deal of confidence from the strategy coming from the Secretary of State around using the courts to challenge what they believe to be unpopular SNP policies, whether that be the Gender Recognition Act, the Deposit Return Scheme, or to a lesser extent, the embedding of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there is no, from my perspective, real hunger or demand for increased devolution at the moment. Moving on to why I think that might change in the near future, the SNP are a formidable campaigning machine. That's why they've won every election since the independence referendum and done so handsomely. If you presume that they will get their act together, then I think you can anticipate some quite strong dividing lines between the SNP and Labour coming to the fore in the next few months. I would point to the different stances Labour and the SNP have, for example, on immigration. The SNP are very pro-immigration and will tie it to an economic necessity within Scotland's economy to have more inward migration. Labour, for reasons south of the border, have an increasingly, I would argue, anti-immigration rhetoric. Equally, the SNP will argue that an independent Scotland would re-enter the European Union. Now, we don't have time to go into the details of that debate today, but that will be their high-level pitch, whereas Labour have made it very clear that they will not re-enter the European Union. Of course, we have markedly higher support for the European Union in Scotland than we do elsewhere within the United Kingdom. And finally, the SNP will argue that they would enhance social security. And I think we'll see increasingly from Labour a sentiment in the opposite direction, one about fiscal restraint. Certainly that's been Rachel Reeves' positioning in the past, and I think we'll hear more of that again. So that does open up some new dividing lines between the two parties, and it could reignite a conversation about further powers for the Scottish Parliament in the aftermath of that general election. So whatever the result, I still think you could see the SNP move to a territory where they are arguing for devolution of employment law, devolution of immigration, in particular to tackle some of these fundamental economic differences between Scotland's needs and the rest of the United Kingdom. Just finally, as I creep up to my 5 minutes of opening, I do think there's a way forward here to build support for greater powers for the Scottish Parliament. If you follow this issue closely, you'll know that Stephen Noon, a former advisor to the SNP, is doing a lot of work trying to bring like-minded people together. I'm loosely involved in the outskirts of that work. And I think the way to do this is to start asking some fundamental questions about what Scotland needs, what Scotland's big challenges are in the future, and how powers might be used to meet those challenges. I can give you 2 examples of that just very quickly. The first one is housing. I'm very involved in housing policy. And it's very difficult at the moment for the Scottish Government or indeed local authorities to build social housing for everything to do with Brexit, rising cost of materials, etc., etc. I think there's a strong case to make for a devolving housing benefit that would incentivise the Scottish Government and local authorities to see the benefits of investing in social housing in their own budget lines. So at the moment, of course, a housing benefit or a reduction in the housing benefit bill would be felt by the UK government. There's an inverse incentive there for the Scottish Government to get people out of private rented sector accommodation where they're in receipt of housing benefit into social housing, where they won't directly or instantly see that benefit. And the second one, looking to the recent work of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, is we have a huge ageing population demographic time bomb coming down the line, and we desperately need Scottish families to have more children to increase our working population. And I think there's an awful lot of arguments to be made around that in terms of further powers to the Scottish Parliament that could enable supporting families. That takes us back to employment law, of course, but it's also much deeper and much broader than that. And I'll stop there, Alan. Thank you.
Fantastic, Kezia. Thank you so much. And I particularly welcome anyone who questions the chair and the things that the chair might have said. Quite right. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and join this panel. So just speaking in my introductory remarks to the sort of English story here in relation to devolution. I mean, obviously England occupies a very different place in the conversation about the devolved union, most obviously because of its relative size, both in demographic and economic terms, but also I think because of the deep-lying assumption in British politics that England, it does not need its own distinctive forms of governance or recognition. And that's an idea that has been flowed pretty consistently through the last couple of centuries, been challenged at times. But alongside that sort of condition is a recurrent debate, which has been running really for the last 5 to 6 decades in British politics about the need for an intermediate institutional layer to be built, sitting between central government and local councils. And governments led by both main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, have broadly agreed there should be such a thing, but really quite fundamentally disagreed about what that model should look like and at what geographical scale it ought to be established. And so there's been an extraordinary amount of policy churn and reversing of policies over that period. As something that I've documented in a report I wrote with Jack Newman recently. You can look at that for all the sort of gory detail about the sort of impact really of that policy seesawing. The current political moment is unusual, I think, in that it looks like there's a tacit consensus between the leaderships of both main parties about the merits of the model that we've been witnessing for some years emerging. It's broadly one of the combined authorities, usually, not always, but mostly headed by an elected metro mayor. And I think what's also underpinning that consensus is the view of both parties, which is laid out in the Brown Review as well, that actually devolution in England is one of the keys to tackling problems of imbalances in the regional economy. But there are also differences and dilemmas, and we shouldn't, I think, evade those, and they will certainly, I think, play out in the short-term policy debate here. One is whether a question that's beginning to emerge of whether central government will retain control and oversight of those combined authorities that have the most developed deals. So you'd be familiar with these trailblazer deals announced for the West Midlands and Greater Manchester. And related to that is a wider debate starting up about what are the forms of governance arrangement and accountability that are going to be needed to make those more developed models work, and also others as they move up the line towards that kind of deal. Now, the UK government published a recent accountability framework, which did address some of these issues, but also, I think, threw up some oddities. I mean, I think the idea of panels of local MPs overseeing the work of combined authority mayors is something that ought to be debated at the very least. But I think there's a bigger issue that it hasn't yet got to grips with because it's very difficult, which is the question of whether the model, the embedded model of political accountability, which was developed in Greater Manchester, whereby the mayor is held to account, as it were, by local council leaders, does that work when it's transferred to mayoral authorities in other areas? And certainly those of you familiar with the issues in the west of England will see that there are some real potential difficulties there. Another, I think, emerging policy dilemma is how much variation within this model governments of either colour are going to permit. If current plans are implemented, so the deals we've got plus those that look like they're in train, then by 2024, pretty much all of England's core cities will have what look like city regional mayors. But what's left is a large part of England which just doesn't have that kind of practical or economic geography. Often it's more rural or is a mix of rural and peri-urban contexts. And so what kinds of governance arrangements work there is a really very difficult issue. And it's an issue that is being worked on at the moment in a variety of negotiations ongoing between central government and different coalitions of authority. And again, a big policy question here is, will Labour, as the Brown Review signals, take a more permissive approach to the emergence of different kinds of models in relation to those contexts? So changes are ongoing. The policy debate is live. This is in flux. But I think we can see a host of more what you call more fundamental policy issues that are sort of now moving to the edge of the horizon. And I think governments are almost bound to want to confront. Very quickly, those are the question of whether a degree of fiscal independence ought to be, some sort of form of financial independence ought to be accorded to these authorities. And we know that historically there's been greatly resisted in parts of central government, notably the Treasury. And also it's also a difficult issue in its own right. The second question is about capability. What kinds of capacity, what sorts of skill sets are needed to really develop these forms of authority so that they can provide the kinds of good governance, foresight, and sort of analytical depth to the work that is undoubtedly needed in terms of the challenges facing those regions. At the moment, if you compare any serious answer to that question with what's being provided, there's almost a chasm, and that's a really big deficit. And then thirdly, what needs to change at the centre of British government? What would have to alter in order to yield the potential that devolution in England offers? And that, I think, you can understand in two ways. One is a sort of very nuts and bolts institutional question that some of you will recognise, which is about the fragmented way in which devolution policy is made, relationships are handled in different parts of Whitehall. Is there now a case for trying to brigade some of those and creating a more clearly demarcated unit or department which is responsible for devolution? And in the shorter term, what will happen to DLUC, of course, is a kind of immediate way into that question. And then just finally, I just finish, Alan, if I may, on, because I think those are all very important and increasingly pressing issues, but I think there is almost a sort of meta level question that is so sort of blindingly obvious in many ways to those of us who live in England that we almost forget to articulate it. And I think it haunts this debate. And that really is this, whether the current system of English administration, is that going to be made even more complicated, even more opaque, and potentially even more dysfunctional by further reforms? Because the governance of England is frankly in a mess, and that's partly as a result of some of the processes I mentioned earlier. It's also, I think, an unforeseen impact of devolution elsewhere. So that for citizens, for ordinary people in England, pretty basic questions about who can I hold responsible for the decisions over this particular service or over transport in my town are incredibly difficult, unusually difficult to answer compared to many other Western democracies. Now, those issues may not matter to most people most of the time. We know that from polling evidence. There's no great clamour for more subnational devolution, but that sense of tolerance, or maybe it's indifference to those arrangements and to their, I would argue, increasing dysfunction, has, I think, been contingent on the assumption that central government will do the heavy lifting when it comes to providing public services competently, to securing economic stability, to making people feel that the current model delivers a roughly balanced sense of outcomes across the union state. Now, arguably, none of those conditions apply. We've lived through an extended period where I would argue all of those are now up for question. And so I think the question of how the English feel about their own governance, the way in which they are governed, may in that context become more of a constitutional issue. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. Lots of detailed material to get our teeth into there. So we'll have some discussion among the panelists now for the next 20 minutes or so. Then we'll turn to audience questions. We've had some audience questions already, which is great. There's definitely space still for some more. So if you do have some questions that have been brewing in your mind, now is the time to submit them. And just remember, you can do that in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. But before we get there, some questions for me. So it strikes me that there are two kind of areas of discussion that come out of what you've said there. One to do with the structure of the union and the distribution of powers and distribution of powers between the constituent parts of the union. And then the other is to do with governance and democracy within the constituent parts of the union. So just on the first of those, one question that very much arises for me listening to you is it actually possible to find a settlement for the union as a whole that will work for all of the constituent parts of the union? So Anwen, in your remarks, you talked about radical federalism and a voluntary union where the nations come together as a partnership of equals. And I think the Independent Commission has suggested that's one possible model. It's also suggested that there may be a slightly less kind of maximalist model around entrenching the devolution structure further. But still, the Commission is of the view that we need to move further in changing the structure of the union. Kezia, you've also talked about the need to move further powers to Scotland. Whereas from an English perspective, I guess the idea of a partnership of equals might seem a bit kind of surprising to many people in England. And many people might question whether they want to be part of a union such as that. So, yeah, is it possible to come up with a central settlement that will keep all of the parts of the union happy? Perhaps we should go to Mike first and explore some of those challenges that might arise from what Anwen and Kezia have talked about, and then we can go around. Mike.
Well, there's a short answer and a long answer. I'll give you the short answer is probably not in terms of depending on what we mean by happy, I suppose. But I mean, the longer answer is that I think there are, you know, a lot of this depends on the sort of timescale that we're thinking about here. I mean, I also think it depends on whose views we care about. So I think, going back to the English perspective here, one of the difficulties in terms of constitutional design, I think, in this area is that it's not entirely clear what the English do want, and that is primarily because they haven't really been asked or engaged in the kinds of constitutional discussion that certainly happened in Scotland in the 1980s, and that Anwen's describing, you know, the project of the commission that's going on in Wales, which I mean, it's very interesting to hear that, given, you know, it makes so notable the absence of something like that in England. So I think, you know, one issue here is that, and, you know, arguably there are similar points perhaps apply at the popular level in other parts of the union as well. There is the degree of flux and uncertainty and also disagreement about what is the optimal solution for each of the parts is really quite marked, and I think we can't just ignore that. And I think sometimes it's tempting as constitution experts to reach for a perfect design and sort of hope that those disagreements and uncertainties will go away. That's one point. But just to come back to the timescale point, which is the longer bit, I think these things are processes. They're not, you know, getting towards forms, structures, institutional settlements which are roughly going to work and deliver for both political elites and people something that they feel accommodates them more, and at the same time respecting, you know, the core values of the UK Union, parliamentary sovereignty, the historical manner in which the Union state has evolved and developed. There's some very strong path dependencies there. That's not something that you can do overnight. And I think one of the interesting things here is that now that we are, to a degree, outside a sort of moment of crisis, certainly the 2014 Scottish referendum, then Brexit, and then COVID in a different way, which I think also stress tested the union from a different angle. Now that we're outside those moments, I think there's a very interesting question of whether we use that opportunity to engage citizens, to have a set of conversations which actually try to think in a somewhat more dispassionate and less sort of egregiously politically motivated way or partisan way about what are the structures that are likely to work for the next 20 to 30 years.
And do you have any particular process in mind there for how that kind of conversation takes place?
Well, I'm tempted to answer by saying I have a book that's coming out on some of these issues, and it touches on those. So you'll wait for the full answer to see. You can see it there. I mean, the short answer is, I mean, it is difficult. I mean, one of the as you yourself know, I mean, there's been a huge set of developments in terms of citizens' engagement techniques, using different methods to sort of try to sort of talk to people, either in their locality or at a wider scale. There's an example of I think a region-wide deliberative event which happened a few years ago on this in Sheffield. I mean, there are methodologies that are available now which I think could be very useful to combine with a sort of political level discussion. I mean, I just can't really see any way through this unless the politicians themselves both become, I think particularly at Westminster here, more engaged around issues relating to the union, more, I think, conversant with the realities of devolution. I think one of the many things we learned during COVID and the inquiry, I think it's ongoing, will touch on this, is that the lack of understanding about the devolution settlements and their implications within Whitehall as well as in the political level was incredibly stark, and actually undoubtedly, I think, shaped some of the, particularly early on, some of the poor decision making that followed. So I think there's a sort of almost an educational project that needs to happen. We need to find, I think, spaces outside kind of frontline political combat to do that. There are very few political incentives, as you know, to do so. I happen to think that the devolution question in England is a really good way to take that forward in the English context, and from there to start the sort of engagement with questions about the union as a whole. But that's all going to take time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anwen, the Independent Commission has, of course, been doing some of this engagement process, and you talked a little bit about that in your remarks. So you might want to say a bit more about that, but also this first question of, I presume the Commission has also thought a lot about the issue of whether what is good for Wales is also going to be acceptable to the rest of the Union.
Yes. So in terms of the options the Commission is looking at, it is looking at certainly options for fundamental reform. And from that perspective, whether what would work for Wales would be not so much good for the rest of the UK, but almost, how would that work? What could that look like? Leaving aside the question of whether the other parts of the UK would want that or not. But it is also looking at, the less fundamental changes around strengthening devolution, so devolution of more powers to the Senedd or the Welsh Parliament, and also the question of entrenchment. Once you have those powers, how do you protect them? How do you make sure that they're not encroached upon by a higher level of government? So there is that spectrum that we are looking at. I think it's really interesting, this question of, could you ever have something that would work for all parts of the UK? And it's striking, I think, Kezia mentioned in her comments, there's just no appetite, perhaps in Scotland, for, thinking about major constitutional overhauls. Similarly in England, what do the English people want? They don't know, they haven't been asked. Well, let's be clear, people in Wales are not clamouring for fundamental constitutional reform. In these survey questions that ask, the most important issue for you, constitutional reform is not up there anywhere close to the top of that list. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about these questions, because constitutional frameworks inform the kinds of specific policy making that does impact on the things that matter to people around cost of living, around health, around education. These are policy issues that are decided on in constitutional contexts. So in that respect, I think it is important that we ask the bigger questions, even if people don't think they're important. And our experience as a commission has been that, in trying to go out and talk to ordinary citizens about these questions, if you take the time to do that, and to do that in a way which is understandable and engaging, people have views on these things, and they want to talk about them. So just because these are not issues that people want necessarily to think about doesn't mean that they're not important or that they shouldn't have the chance to talk about them. And I think that brings me back to what Mike was saying about, the political interest and will here to talk about these bigger constitutional issues, because they're very difficult and challenging, and absolutely they would take up a lot of time and possibly a lot of political capital. So I understand why political parties maybe don't want to embrace these big issues, but for me, they really are fundamental to the way in which the union works, the way in which devolution works, and the way in which that territorial constitution does impact on the daily lives of people and these issues that really are important. So there's a dilemma there between not wanting to talk about these things because they're difficult, and yet we really should talk about these things, and the kinds of processes there that Mike was talking about. Somehow having a kind of conversation, I think, is the way to do that. There are different international experiences of how to do that, but also what doesn't work that could be learnt on. But it does need political will, and I'm afraid that is where I think this falls down, because I don't see much of an appetite for that amongst the UK political parties.
Kezia, what's your thinking?
So I agree with much, if not all, of what Anwen's just said. And let me start by saying, look, I get they're not talking about asymmetric federalism in the pubs, like if only they were. But that's not really the conversation that we're trying to have. I think people are talking about how you fundamentally eradicate child poverty, how you deliver economic security, and whatever the question is, the means to the end is actually via a rewiring of Britain and how it works. I heard Anwen say, she's for a form of radical federalism. Me too. I bet we've got slightly different versions of what that looks like, and that's the problem, is it not? Because it's the Heinz constitutional question. There are 57 varieties of federalism or Devo Max. So I don't think you can get 100% of people onto the same page, but I do think you can get 65 to 85% of people celebrating or uniting around a common set of values and solutions. And I think in Scotland, that 65 to 85% of people could come from people who traditionally support Labour, the SNP and the Conservative Party. I do think there is will there. Then you get to the nuts and bolts of how do you actually make that happen? And Anwen's right to focus on that element of it. And the political will is the key part to this equation, because, if you were to organise a summit tomorrow on enhanced powers for the Scottish Parliament, the only way you would get the SNP in the room on that front is if you refused to you would only get the SNP in the room there if a second independence referendum was on the table. And you would only get the Conservatives there if a second independence referendum was not on the table, right? So there are impasses here that I don't have immediate answers to, but you could find answers to through a process of deliberation. I think that only comes after a general election, though. I think the idea that we can have nuanced, clever, sophisticated conversations about this any point between now and the general election next October is really for the birds.
And why do you think it is that the approach of Scottish unionists and indeed Northern Irish unionists and Westminster-based unionists is very different from the approach of unionists in Wales. So as Anwen was talking about, Welsh Labour is very keen to talk about the union and possible restructuring of the union, whereas all other unionists in all other parts of the UK are desperate not to talk about the union and think that talking about the union is a way of talking about the disbanding of the union. I mean, is it just that in Wales the independence cause is lower in the polls still, and therefore it seems like a more distant prospect, so it's easier to kind of take that risk, whereas in Scotland it's harder to take the risk? Or is there something else going on? And could Scottish unionists take a different approach from the one they take?
They could, but they're certainly not going to gamble on it this side of a general election. So I don't think it's any more complicated than you know, if support for independence is at 48%, the SNP can bank on getting 40% of that at least in any electoral context by talking about independence. The Conservatives' recent electoral success in Scotland, which may have peaked and be falling back, is not based on their domestic policy platform, it's based on their unionism. So they will be very solidly against the second independence referendum in any form, countenancing it in any way. And in fact, because of what they've done recently around taking the Scottish Parliament to court over the issues that I mentioned earlier, the muscular unionism is very much to the fore, and they're drawing a lot of confidence from that. That leaves you with Labour, whose electoral challenge right now is to garner votes from people who voted both yes and no. So they can appeal to SNP voters by talking about further devolution, but the risk in doing that is that they lose no voters who don't want any further kind of gift to be given to the Scottish Parliament, because of my opening remarks earlier, which is that to do so is to be seen as ceding power to the nationalists rather than about fundamentally addressing the question of what is in the best interest of making devolution work across the whole of the four nations of the United Kingdom.
So interesting, so interesting. We'll go to questions from the audience in just a few minutes, but one final question from me before we do so. So we've been talking about kind of big reforms to the structure of the union as a whole. And one of the themes of this conference is that the UK constitution has been kind of in the wars a bit over the last few years for one reason and another. And we're keen to think about, are there kind of easy wins, easy things that those in power could do in order to help restore the constitution a little bit in various different ways. Could I ask each of you, what would you say in this terrain that we've been talking about here, what kinds of easy wins might you highlight? Kezia, you've seen politics from the other side. What would you highlight?
Can I give you an example of devolution from Scottish Government to local authorities? Does that fit?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So one quick win from my perspective, if I were advising and making myself special advisor to First Minister Humza Yousaf, would be to scrap Skills Development Scotland as a national skills agency. I think all the powers it has would be much better utilised a local authority area, if not for the purposes of regional economic partnerships. I've just come back from spending a couple of days in Shetland, where the Parliament in Edinburgh feels as distant to them as London does, and they have big challenges around their skills agenda to capitalise on what's left of North Sea oil and gas and to transition towards cleaner renewable energy. They want to be able to make those powers in their own community, and I think that argument applies in the northeast of Scotland just as it does around agriculture and rural industries in the border areas of Scotland. So a quick win for Humza Yousaf would be scrap Skills Development Scotland, devolve those powers down, save £300 million plus of an arm's length quango, and await for Job Centre Plus powers to come and be used alongside it when Labour win the next election and the Brown Review is enacted.
Having grown up in the Highlands, I can confirm that Edinburgh feels very distant. And is there anything that the UK government could do, Kezia? I mean, in its approach to the union, is there anything that it could simply change?
Lots, but it won't. I think they're very confident that the muscular unionism is paying dividends for them. I can't see any change in their strategy this side of a general. And
would UK Labour take a different approach?
After a general election?
Yeah.
Possibly, I think they'll have to. It's a bit like we know that the House of Lords element of the Brown Review is a central plank of how they talk now, but in the early days of a Labour government, it'll be incredibly difficult to prioritise and deliver. So they will have to go surely to other elements of the Brown Report to show some progress on that mission to rewire Britain.
There's the audience members who were in the first session this morning on Parliament heard Sangam Debonair confirming that Labour fully intends to abolish the House of Lords in its current form within the first Parliament. We will see whether that really happens. Mike, what are your thoughts on quick wins?
Quickish wins, and I don't know how quick these could be delivered, but I mean, just under two headings, I suppose, at the UK government level, and here I slightly disagree with Kezia, actually. I think beneath the sound and fury of sort of what people call musculinism is actually a degree of, there's a mixture of concern and uncertainty about the way in which the union is handled by British government. And I think that actually is something that's shared across the two main parties. So a very practical thing would be to go back, dust down the Dunlop review and have a look at some of its proposals, which I think are, don't agree with them all, but I think it's one of the most interesting, serious examinations of how the problems in the way in which the union is managed at the centre of British government. It really sort of challenges some of the sort of fragmented structural issues there, that the fact that there is no single place where the union is sort of thought about, where strategy is developed, where policy is formed. It also gets into some of the cultural issues, I think, that are absolutely vital here, because for all the concerns about structural questions, culture really matters. The union is about relationships, and wanting the relationships to work, both from central government, but also from the other devolved administrations, is absolutely key, I think, to success. Then the other bucket would be on England specifically. I think the parties should really commit to, and mean it, to a deadline in terms of an end point for the emerging devolution process. The government, I think, says 2030 in the Levelling Up White Paper, which is conveniently after the current electoral cycle. I think both parties really need to ensure that there is a degree of, that we get somewhere, that we have something that looks like a finish point for the current moving picture. And then I think there has to be some consideration given to establishing a body outside of government, semi-independent from central government, that really takes the bigger picture look at the emerging geography of English devolution, because there are so many practical issues here around jurisdictions, misalignment between public service geographies and mined authorities. We really need somebody to take a sort of hard look at some of this, and to do it sooner rather than later.
Very good, thank you. Anwen?
Well, a lot of the tensions around how devolution works in Wales comes from the relationship between the Welsh Government and the UK Government and government departments in Whitehall. So I think a quick win would be to implement fully and properly the revised system of intergovernmental relations that came from the review, as announced in 2022, to actually just implement what was set out and agreed in that proposal. That has happened in some areas with some of those forums meeting. It mostly hasn't happened in many other areas. And so I think, you know, at the very least, you could implement that way of managing intergovernmental relations as a way of establishing regular discussions between the devolved government and the London government around the different policy areas, as well as at a higher level of discussing the big things that are policy challenges that go across the devolved domains. And in between those intergovernmental relations, there is a similar thing that you could do around relations with the Welsh Government departments and Whitehall departments, in terms of, again, looking at specific policy challenges and how those are discussed and negotiated. I'm sceptical about that as a quick win that will ever happen, because as Kezia said, I just don't think there's an interest in that, and it comes back to the point made about political culture in Whitehall and more broadly political will in the UK government to actually engage meaningfully with the devolved institutions. I would hope that would be something that would change under a future UK Labour government. But for the time being, it could be a short win, but unlikely, I think to happen.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Let's go to questions from the audience now. Connor will miraculously appear on our screens. There he is. Connor, what questions do you have for us?
Yeah, lots of interesting questions coming in from the audience. I think the first round there are three, one for each member of the panel. So Keith Rathven, a former Welsh Member of Parliament, asks if Anwen could comment on the impact of the proposed dramatic reduction in the number of Welsh MPs from 40 to 32, and the proposed corresponding dramatic increase in the size of the Welsh Senate. David Bowman for Mike asks, do you think the idea of an English Parliament is dead in the water? And finally, John Newham asks Kezia, to what extent is support for Scottish independence conditioned by the possibility of rejoining the European Union?
Fantastic, thank you. Well, let's simply go through those in turn. So the reports of the boundary commissions, as some of you will have noticed, came out at 11:30 this morning. So confirmation of the new boundaries in Wales, as well as other parts of the UK for Westminster elections. So Anwen, do you want to address Keith's question?
Yeah, thank you, Keith. That's an interesting one. I think it poses a challenge immediately for some of the parties around, who gets to stand in some of these new Westminster constituencies. We see a little bit of that playing out already, and there are some interesting internal party divides perhaps emerging around that. I think more broadly, I think it's a really interesting shift in terms of the relative power of these different institutions. So, having less members of Parliament representing Wales versus this really proposed increase in the size of the Senedd. The expectation is that the proposal will be to increase from 60 members to 96 members. And the idea there is, the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, is growing in terms of the competencies. It's almost also as well anticipating perhaps more competencies being devolved to the Welsh Parliament in future. And I think it's interesting in terms of this idea of shifting importance of these institutions, because, for example, in Welsh Labour, there has always been a tension between Welsh Labour members of Parliament versus Welsh members of the Welsh Parliament, and the relative weight of those within the party. And you might expect, with the growth of the Senedd versus the decline in the number of Welsh MPs, that might have a bearing on these kind of internal party discussions. And those kind of discussions do have a meaningful bearing on some of the Welsh Labour policy priorities. So I think it's interesting that we might see that changing of the constituencies and the size of the Senedd perhaps playing through in terms of the internal party politics there.
Very good. Mike, is the prospect of an English Parliament dead in the water?
No, I don't think it is dead in the water. I mean, I think it's interesting to link it to the earlier discussion on radical federalism, because, of course, one implication potentially in some versions of federalism of that model would be that England as a whole would have its own parliament, and then that's a much debated issue, as you know, in constitutional discussion, and usually ruled out of court as something that would sort of lead to the dissolution of the union, wouldn't function. I mean, practical considerations aside, and there's been some interesting work on it, not least from the Constitution Unit a few years ago, I do think that in terms of what the English Parliament idea represents, or who is up for it, it is interesting to think about trends here, because certainly my take on the polling on this is that it's pretty consistent actually over the last 2 decades, that about 20 to 25% of English people will get behind that idea when other options are put alongside it. So they'll express a preference for that idea. And it seems to me about the percentage of people who are the most sort of disenchanted with the way in which the union works and are most inclined to feel a sense of grievance about England's position within it. I think one question is whether a potential future crisis moment actually makes that idea more appealing, whether people get more engaged with it. I mean, going back to Anwen's points, which I agreed with earlier, I mean, often it is at moments of crisis that people suddenly engage in these issues. So I would not rule out that becoming an option. And certainly were there to be another referendum on Scotland's constitutional position, I think it is entirely possible that that might return as an idea. I think the other thing to say very briefly is that there was a lot of focus in the aftermath of the 2014 referendum on the English dimension of parliamentary government. And you'll recall that there was a big focus on introducing a system in the House of Commons to sort of deal with legislation that only applied to England or to England and Wales. Now, that led to a very, very baroque set of rules, which were deeply unloved by MPs from all sides of the House, and they were abolished. I think the deeper question to which that reform spoke about whether the English feel that their own interests as a nation are always protected, or their own voice is adequately expressed within the system of parliamentary government. I'm not sure those questions have necessarily gone away. I think they've abated, possibly in the wake of Brexit and the sense amongst many English people that they got their way on a constitutional issue, or I suppose perhaps we wait to see whether they did fully get their way. But I think that's a latent question, I think, in the wake of devolution elsewhere, and it's not one that has disappeared entirely.
And Kezia, the question about independence and Scottish and EU membership.
So a course answer would say, and if you accept that in 2014 support for independence stood at 45% and you accept that today it stands at 48%, then you can attribute 3% of the difference to the changing situation with regards to membership of the European Union. It's obviously a bit more complex and nuanced than that, but it is worth looking at who the Better Together campaign focused on in the dying days of the 2014 referendum and what their attitudes are to Europe in order to really explain what's going on there. In truth, the No campaign focused on around 400,000 Scots in 2014 who were or could be persuaded to vote yes. And again, bluntly, there were people aged 25 to 45 who lived in urban centres, who were university educated, who were centre-left when it came to social issues, but did care about their own economic security. That's why there was such focus on the currency, the lender of last resort, and pensions, etc., during the 2014 campaign. What's interesting about that segmentation in that particular group of Scots is that they were also very pro the European Union. The people who like to be able to jump on an EasyJet flight and get to European capital very easily. They considered themselves to be Scottish, British and European, etc. So in the aftermath of the EU referendum, faced with the choice between Boris's little Brexit Britain and an independent Europe, an independent Scotland in a progressive Europe, they were erring towards the independent option, and that's why you saw a flurry in support for independence. I think that is falling back ever so slightly now, and of course the difference is that the prospect of a Labour government coming is much more plausible now than it was then. And you've got to think that if you were to do that segmentation again, a large chunk of those 400,000 Scots in the middle could be placated in their support for independence by the prospect of the difference that a Labour government could make in the early days of a new administration. That, however, takes you straight back to the job that Labour still needs to do to convince Scots that things will be markedly different with a Labour government across the United Kingdom than they currently are with the Conservatives.
You talked about people who voted no to independence, but wanted to stay in the EU. Of course, there were also people who voted yes to independence and wanted to leave the EU. And presumably presumably some of them have shifted away from the independence cause as a result of Brexit, which may partly explain the kind of overall stability, relative stability?
So I'm not an expert on that, but I wouldn't want to over-egg the size of that, because really those voters don't have anywhere else to go. You're not going to see, a tranche of SNP supporting farmers in the northeast of Scotland suddenly back UKIP, for example. There's nowhere else really for them to go, so they'll hold their nose and continue to lend their support to the SNP. That said, though, there is a challenge for the SNP in the general election when it comes to policies around climate change in North Sea oil and gas in particular. So big decisions ahead for both Labour and the SNP around things like new licences for exploration could see voters leaving Labour and the SNP to go to the Conservatives, specifically in the northeast of the country. It's completely possible that the SNP could lose seats to the Conservatives in the northeast of Scotland and still be the largest party after the general election, for example.
Gosh, yes. Let's go to another round of questions from Conor.
Yeah, a few more interesting questions. The first one is from Philip Gilfuss, and he asked a question that Michael briefly commented on earlier, but he asks, as we approach the quarter-century mark of national UK devolution, do the respective constituents understand their purpose, or does the educational process of explaining their powers, responsibilities, and actual existence still continue? Second, Richard Johnson asks, in many federal systems, central governments use their fiscal leverage to achieve national policy goals in areas that are not technically central government competencies. Should the UK government place greater conditionality on the funding it transfers to devolved governments? And finally, an anonymous question that was asked for Kezia, but possibly something everyone could speak about is, do you think a UK Labour government will repeal or amend the Internal Market Act?
Wow. Some big questions there. I think all of you are free to pick up what you would like and not pick up what you would like not to pick up. Mike, shall we go to you first in this round?
Sure. Let me just have a very quick go at the first and third there. I think the this point about the purpose of devolution and how well is devolution understood. I mean, just to answer it from a sort of, in terms of UK government, but also perhaps not at England more generally. I mean, I agree with the question, and I still think there is a big job to be done in terms of education, understanding, and connection, I think, with devolution. I mean, the sort of phrase devolve and forget is often used as a way, as a sort of summary of the approach of, I suppose, British government and politics to devolution. And there is some truth in that, but I also think actually it is a more complicated story where there has been for parts of British government a sort of almost a forced learning process. And there have been bits of British government that frankly have engaged more constructively and intelligently with devolution. I think, to pick one department, DEFRA, I think, has a very different history in relation to its relations to devolved governments, to some other departments. And of course, that departments are in different positions as to whether the powers they exercised are in reserved areas, like Home Office predominantly, or say health and social care, which is predominantly devolved elsewhere. So you've got a sort of huge asymmetry within Whitehall, and that means that there's been almost different learning paths here. I think that there is a fairly basic level of a sort of a lack of understanding of some of the, not just the sort of more complicated legal aspects of devolution, but I think a sort of lack of appreciation of politics and of the nature of societies in different parts of the UK, and I would include parts of England outside London and the southeast in that. And that's obviously, those are issues that have surfaced in different ways in our political discourse since Brexit. And I think, you see them manifest in policies like moving bits of Whitehall out of London. But so there's some quite deep questions there. And I think learning to understand devolution better is one part of actually a much bigger challenge facing central government. But I think at the popular level too, we really need
Sorry,
to
can I just,
yeah.
Do you think more devolution within England would change that at all? So or is the degree of devolution that's going to happen within England just so incomparable to what's happened elsewhere that it just wouldn't really scratch the surface?
I mean, change it in what way? Do you mean in terms of
So at the moment, as you said, we have to some extent devolve and forget, and we certainly have a culture in Westminster that just doesn't really think about what's going on at other levels of government often. I mean, would that change if there were more devolution within England, and such that it would then have repercussions for other parts of the Union as well?
I see. I mean, you know, the honest answer there is not necessarily. I mean, as sort of doing this research on how central government has operated in the context of devolution in all, and indeed in relation to local government and devolved government in England, looking at all of those things together, I'm struck more by the similarities in terms of the sort of relationship with and treatment of different levels of government than I am differences across different sort of territorial parts. So I don't think devolution in England is a magic bullet. However, I do think there is an opportunity here to, you know, partly because of geographical proximity, but also because some mayors are beginning to become pretty powerful figures in their own right politically. I think, and also I think there is an opening actually within Whitehall, a sort of degree of recognition in some places that actually the way in which central government has geared itself to deal with devolution has not been quite right. Now, some of that goes to the intergovernmental process, where I very much agree with what Anwen said earlier, but some of it goes to a recognition, I think, that actually different departments have been pretty slow to actually comprehend the implications of devolution. So I think for different reasons, maybe English devolution is part of it, we could be moving into a more productive relationship there.
Great, thank you. Kezia, so we've got two further questions on fiscal leverage and conditionality, and also on the Internal Market Act and its future. Where would you like to go?
Some nice easy ones there. I just made some notes in the round on that question set. I mean, I think it's fair to say that after 25 years, most Scots recognise the Scottish Parliament as the dominant political institution within the country, that's cemented. They don't necessarily understand, though, what it does and what it's responsible for. There's a variance there. So I would suggest that you're far more likely to find that Scots understand education policy, for example, is within the purview of the Scottish Government. Far fewer Scots would be able perhaps to explain that the Scottish Parliament is now in charge of many disability benefits, for example, or there be awareness that Scots pay a higher rate of income tax than their English counterparts do, and that was the direct result of a power that the Scottish Parliament got in recent history. So I do think it's a variable picture. On the question of the Internal Market Act, I'm going for a Michael Kenny answer of, well, it depends, really. I think it depends on a number of different factors, including the size, if any, of Labour's majority after the general election, and its confidence and willingness, therefore, to steam into issues that are connected to the European Union and alignment to EU issues more generally. I also think it depends on what the purpose of revisiting that Internal Market Act is, and the clamour for that. So what is it that you want to change? Much of the conversation in Scotland right now around the Internal Market Act is around the deposit return scheme, for example, which has become a huge kind of constitutional issue, which is fundamentally about whether you get 20 pence back or not for a plastic or glass bottle, discuss in your local grocery store. It's very, very small in the grand scheme of public policy, but it's blown up by constitutional dynamic. And the other depends I would throw into that mix is, of course, very soon after the next general election, we will have a Scottish Parliament election. And for the first time in a very long time, it is possible, plausible, if still a little unlikely, that Labour could be in power in both the Scottish Parliament and the United Kingdom. And I think that throws up a whole new dynamic about devolution and how policy is done on a sort of international level as a result of that. So that's my cop out to bank on three different types of depends on that last question.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. And Anwen, what would you like to pick up?
Well, let me pick up the question about conditionality for fiscal transfers. I mean, yes, certainly you can imagine why that might be attractive to a state level government using that kind of conditionality to achieve policy outcomes across the state. That, however, I think would sit quite problematically with kind of this idea that, you know, for a party like Welsh Labour, you know, we want the tools, the fiscal tools, to raise funds ourselves and then decide for ourselves how we spend that money. So that idea of conditionality is a tricky one. It points to, I think, a problem with this idea of radical federalism, or any kind of federalism as some of these parties talk about it, in that these are still very vague ideas. They're not very well worked through models of constitutional change. And so there are a lot of these tensions between, you know, the kind of top level, this is the kind of union that we want, versus what in practice that might mean, and how in practice that might mean like places like Wales might lose out in terms of some of the powers that it either has at the moment or would like to have. So there's a difficulty there, I think. That kind of conditionality might be more palatable within a federal system, provided that you have much clearer structures of shared governance, where there is a clearer set of relationships that bring the lower levels of government into discussions with that federal level government in a way where they have a meaningful say over and discussion around these kind of broader set of policy priorities. That could be a way of managing the tension that comes with this idea of wanting conditionality at that federal level versus a desire of kind of the components of the federation to keep control of their own resources.
Would be great if we could get into lots more detail on some of these detailed points, but alas, time is very short. I think we do have time maybe for one final question. I know Connor has a round of questions. Is there one question that you could pick out for us, Connor, rather than trying to do a full round?
Yes, so there's one question that's been phrased with the Scottish context in mind, but I think it probably applies to lots of what we've been talking about. So David Rogers asks, perhaps the biggest change we've seen in devolution in Scotland is the weakening of the Sewell Convention as the key lever in negotiations between the Scottish government and Westminster institutions. I'd be interested in the panel's view about where this is going, and whether, for example, the Brown proposals could take us back to the devolution settlement that the people voted for in 1997.
A good question on which to end, in fact. Very quick final remarks from each of you. We just have a couple of minutes in total. Shall we go in the order in which you... Actually, let's start with Kezia, because it is framed in terms of Scotland, and so it's fair to start with Kezia, and then maybe Anwen and Mike. Kezia.
So I think relationships between the Scottish and UK governments are so poor that it would be very difficult at the moment to reset relationships in such a way that you could bring Sewell Convention back to the fore. It's not just in the context of the court disputes I've detailed earlier. It's tactical and it's political in the view of the electoral contests that are coming up. I do think it's possible post general election. So basically I'm putting everything on hold, Alan, in the hope of a more reasonable political debate until after the next general election.
Very good. Anwen.
I agree that political confidence in Sewell as a political convention has evaporated. So I don't think that can continue to work on that basis. How might you entrench that? I think the Gordon Brown proposals were interesting. So Sewell would become one of these constitutional principles that would be defended by a revised House of Lords or Assembly of the Nations and Regions, I think it would be called, and that body would make it more difficult to go against this convention. I don't think it's a foolproof way of proceeding. It kind of assumes that the interests of this new assembly would be to protect devolved interests, but that entirely depends on the composition of that new assembly. and to what extent that assembly actually would be able to give a strong voice to the interests of the devolved regions of the UK, which is by no means a given, depends on how it's elected and so on. So Sewell as a political convention, I think, is dead. How you might entrench that is more difficult, I think, to see.
Great, thank you. And Mike, 1 minute.
1 minute. Well, I pretty much agree with Anwen. So that's most of my, the rest of my minute. I'll just say that, you know, Sewell was invented in part because it was a way, I suppose, of trying to square the circle between parliamentary sovereignty and the self-government ethos of devolution. And I think what we've learned, obviously principally in the context of Brexit, but I think outside that now as well, is that those two values don't always sit together. They do sometimes clash, and we've been reminded of that very vividly. So I think Sewell in its previous form is probably dead. I think entrenching it is an interesting idea. I still am not convinced that will square the circle, frankly, that Sewell was initially invented to address.
Fantastic. Well, we've covered a huge amount of ground there. I feel we've raised many questions and maybe answered some of them, but many of them I think we'll have to return to. We've talked a lot about the future of the Union, perhaps a bit less about devolution within England and indeed within other parts of the Union as well. So perhaps particularly these are themes that we'll want to return to in future events. Before I ask audience members to join me in thanking the speakers, a few little bits of housekeeping. So the recording of this session will appear on our YouTube channel and podcast feed in the coming days. Please do subscribe to those if you don't already, or look out for information on our website or Twitter. If you're not already subscribed to our events mailing list, you can do so and be the first to hear about our forthcoming events. Just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. The next session of this conference starts in just 45 minutes time at 2:30. The topic is the courts and the rule of law. And speakers include the Shadow Attorney General and Labour MP Emily Thornberry, Conservative MP Laura Farris, and the Chief Executive of Justice, Fiona Rutherford. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. The Zoom call will end in just a moment, but you will be able to join again using the same link as you used for this session in order to join that next session. So let me thank all of you in the audience for attending, and let me on your behalf thank our excellent, fantastic speakers, Anwen Elias, Kezia Dugdale and Mike Kenny, as well as Conor Kelly for fielding the questions and the team behind the scenes for making everything run so smoothly. So goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again very shortly.